no one, to the best of my knowledge, has had yet translated into English. And you know, it's kind of an interesting thing, the Gebser Conference, because for so many people, they're so moved by one book, which there's an inherent danger in that. That we know that one book and we've read that one book. And anytime you encounter a group of people who have but one book that they live by, that can be very frightening. And so I've tried to maybe expand that a little bit. And so, well, I'll just start, and I'll weave in some comments to the paper. So I called this paper Humanity and Technology in Gebser's Later Works. I want to start with a quote from Gebser. He said, "Now there seems to be no woman or man, but the so-called masses. Worse, the presupposition, that is, the negative point of mankind, the threatened man, who might be conscious of the threat of his own self." That came from a work called Human or Apparatus. And I'm going to talk about where these pieces came from and how we got them. Toward the end of his life, Gebser wrote many short works that are unknown to the English-speaking audience. Some of them reside with Dr. Hemmerle in Switzerland, and some of them are part of the Jean Gebser Special Collection in the Library of the History of Science at the University of Oklahoma's Bizzell Library, that were brought there by Eric Kramer and Al McCunis. These works remain untranslated and thus unknown to most of the Gebserian scholars, which is sad, as they give us insight into Gebser's continued theory development and are a window into Gebser's mind, allowing us to learn what questions drove him at different points in his life, and in this case, at the beginning and the end of the 1960s. The present essay examines two of the essays in the Oklahoma Special Collection. The first, Human or Apparatus in the Modern State, appeared in 1961, and the other, The Complementarity of Western and Asian Technology, came in 1968, near the end of the decade. The first discusses a troubling existentialism of life in the modern world that I believe is still relevant these 55 years later. The other was a published part of a dialogue with Wilhelm Bitter, former book publisher, anti-Nazi, papal honoree, was honored by John the 23rd, post-war mayor of Recklinghausen, regional politician from 1946 to 1961, and publisher of the well-respected weekly Catholic newspaper Echo der Zeit. As a discussion of these two works, this essay will be presented in two parts, and probably now I'll get to the first part pretty thoroughly. First, I will discuss each of the two essays individually, and then I will situate the two essays within the larger picture of Gebserian thought and with the contemporary conversation as regards technology, largely that we get from folks like Lewis Mumford. I will present these essays in chronological order, beginning with Human or Apparatus. Human or Apparatus in the Modern State is 29 paragraphs long, spread over 14 pages. It appears in a work called Zur Rettung des Menschlichen in unserer Zeit, which means To the Rescue of Humanity in Our Time, by Wilhelm Bitter and published by Klett Verlag in Stuttgart. Again, 1961. The book was the conference proceedings of a conference called Doctor and Pastor, held in the summer of 1960 in Stuttgart. Ironically, ironic that I'm talking about this piece because here at a Catholic university, it was debuted at a conference in Catholic pastoral issues. So I guess it's coming full circle. Among the many other presenters at this conference were Karlfeld von Durkheim. Now, he's an interesting fellow. He was a legally Jewish Nazi Party emissary to Japan who practiced Zen in an Allied post-war prison, and more than anybody, may be responsible for the importation of Zen into the United States. I'm looking at you, Jason. because he hosted Kapleau in Japan. Kapleau, of course, is the author of the 3 Pillars of Zen, which is, I would imagine, a pretty good starting point for a lot of people in the West getting into that. Other attendees and presenters were Catholic journalist, philosopher, psychotherapist, and anti-racialist Ernst Michel, theologian, Catholic priest, and Jungian Joseph Goldbrunner, who participated in a 1957 conference that launched the catechism movement in the United States. So anybody who's still suffering from Catholic school as a child can blame him. Gebser's paper at that point asked 3 questions. Number 1, what is the apparatus of the modern state? Now, by state, he doesn't mean state of being, he means state, nation state. What is the apparatus of the modern state? Second, how do we overcome the danger of the modern state? He assumes that there's danger of the modern state. And 3, what is the human being in the context of the state? Those are his 3 questions. Again, what's the apparatus of the state? How do we overcome its danger? And what is the human being? So Gebser's contribution to this conference begins on a sad, poetic note. He begins thus: today in the West, there is a certain sense of defenses, which is welcome as such, but which springs from a feeling of inner and external threat. That's his first sentence. There is certainly a Cold War overtone to Gebser's words, the meaning of which had to have resonated even more when their print publication coincided almost to the month with the Cuban Missile Crisis. Even in 1960, when he delivered them, Gebser's German audience was living along the US-NATO defense line of bases. I have this beautiful slide, which I'm not showing you right now, of a map of 1960 Germany with a line that goes north to south of American bases, many of which, of course, were nuclear. Seven major US Army units were headquartered in West Germany in the 60s. Should World War III have broken out between the US and the USSR, West Germany would have been the front line. One can therefore guess at the sense of external threat that Gebser imagined. When you add to that East Germany is right next door, Iron Curtain adjacent, so to speak. That's what a realtor would say. Iron Curtain adjacent. Facing a totalitarian threat from the USSR through East Germany, with the memories of Nazism still very fresh, Gebser quickly comes to the central question, or the first question. What does it mean to be human in the age of the modern state? The state to Gebser is an entity with many smaller parts, each with its impersonal and non-human function. The touch of humanity is lost in this state. Gebser asks, man is still human, or is he the apparatus of an apparatus? Has he been degraded to the mere function of a neutral, namely the state? The state is not human, and humans are subsumed by it and serve it. So our humanity has no place. Gebser asks about the nature of the state itself, eschewing the definition of the modern nation in favor of, and you'll be surprised by this as Gebserian, a very carefully and thorough laid out discussion of the development of power and governance over the eons. He discusses the cults of the great mother cultures prior to 6000 BCE. He says that at that time the women ruled as culture was built. In roughly the 3rd millennium, he says, and this is a quote, the social form is radically revolutionized, which by its very nature seems to have turned everything upside down. Gebser describes the shift from the matriarchy to the patriarchy in catastrophic terms. He says, the plow, which was a powerful tree trunk, rips the lap of Mother Earth. The harmony of earlier times is replaced with something terrible, especially for women. He says, the women who had been the goddess, the woman who had been the goddess, now becomes a slave rising to the command. The process of patriarchalization takes a conscious form in classical Greek democracy. Gebser explains that human consciousness awakens from a family or a clan unformulated state into the first moment when, quote, the human being stands, and it is the man who deliberately opposes heaven and earth. Deliberately opposes heaven and earth. This is significant because it's the man's, using the word literally and metaphorically, ascendance to power. As Gebser says, since then, it has been the man who governs the world. Human mastery occurs through a process of differentiating our species from the rest of creation. This is particularly true in the West. Of Western man, Gebser says, I need to use a different voice like I do when I read to my kids. Maybe a German accent or something. This Western man who thinks logically and purposefully, and is no longer a prisoner of the orbit and wheel of destiny, no longer merely takes the world out, but goes out of its habits, for example, by means of philosophy and science, which originates in Greece. Disconnection from nature became a conscious patriarchy that was not content with destroying the matriarchy, but went on to destroy the monarchy in the French Revolution, and then religion, with Hegel's statement that God is dead. That's 1807. A patriarchy conscious of its own nature and power cannot allow itself to be constrained by an aristocracy or by any religious institution. Gebser argues that the consequence of an unfettered patriarchy is the loss of the soul into what he says is the, quote, patriotic form of the state. I'm thinking about people at political rallies right now, as Jason was talking about, losing their soul to this state. Gebser calls the age of Western revolutions a period of, quote, I love this quote, a nihilistic system of nihilism in our nihilistic intoxication. The self-destruct of our culture that required generations to pass for humanity to recover. Immediately following the revolutions, the individual loses all personal worth in the context of the power and size of the state. In the 1800s, there is no role for the individual, Gebser says, by the way, who, quote, returned to the dull unconscious of the blind masses, to the destiny free. The job of the 19th century citizen was to obey. Gebser says they bore the spirit of corpse obedience. In the authoritarian regimes of the East, Gebser saw, quote, the Greek human being, already valid for the stamp of Asiatic satrapism. Gebser knew that more promising human action was possible. After all, the reign of terror began with Robespierre's declarations about human worth. Echoes of slave owner Jefferson's sentiments about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Something better would eventually come. But, as Gebser said, it takes generations to recover from vital, psychological, and mental shocks and confusions that bring about every serious growth crisis, every deeply changing life. Gebser says that in such times, the new has not already been suggested. In these revolutionary periods, again, both literally and metaphorically, conscious appears in exaggerated form. Gebser says, it seems as if there is no one. The emptiness stares at us. Everything seems to be at best or better. In the worst case, one falls into former lives which are dead. So the dictators were and are still, and therefore also the death and the killing. Ironically, both extremes express the subsuming of the individual into the state, the interim state, but not ultimate end of the rise of Gebser's patriarchy. It's no surprise that the state should express both extremes of human consciousness, as, quote, destiny also became the servant of man. Destiny became the servant of man. That is, man was not satisfied after the destruction of the goddess or the kings or even of God. Man needed to conquer destiny itself. But with the age of legends behind us, only the state is big enough to subdue destiny. Gebser expresses it in this way. What can or could replace the destroyed patriarchy? Who had ruled so far? First the woman, then the man. Where did the man remain? Now there seems to be no woman or no man but the so-called masses. Worse, the presupposition that is the negative point of mankind, the threatened man who might be conscious of the threat of his own self. I already read you that. Here's the rest. Could it not be possibly be man in man and woman who is now to be called rule? Not only the life-sustaining, but the devouring mother. Not just the living, but also the killing father. Not merely the we of the maternal world, not just the ego of the paternal. And yet to this grim question, Gebser, which admittedly has been a pretty big bummer up until this point in this essay, offers a cautiously optimistic answer. The better aspects of human nature and consciousness. Gebser says, I am not saying that this will happen, but I believe that such an expulsion is already underway. For that to happen, humans need to challenge not just the state, which is the manifestation of an idea, but the idea of the state itself. Gebser points out important moments in the development of the relationship of people with a subsuming state, from Machiavelli to the communist comrades of 1960, to the characters in novels by Huxley and Kafka, Orwell, Kogan, Kessler, and others. Gebser sees an underlying commonality of self-betrayal in the service of a nihilistic state, an absurd condition in which one nullifies his actual humanity for the sake of something unreal and unconcerned with the lives of the people that create and perpetuate it. Gebser's solution to this problem is the promise of human consciousness. Perhaps because the essay was delivered as a paper at a Catholic conference, Gebser begins by situating human consciousness in Christian terms. He says, man is on earth the conscious bearer of the spiritual principle. Gebser hesitates to carry this argument further because of its sectarian specificity, explaining, quote, we leave the religious aside because it is often seen as a dogmatic confession, which is not acceptable to everyone. Instead of making a purely theological argument, Gebser returns to his broader discussion of human consciousness, recounting the phylogeny of consciousness from the sleepy consciousness of the we, the matriarchal clan, through the mutation to awakening the consciousness of the ego, that's his term, to the consciousness of the patriarchy. Gebser argues that another transformation is occurring at that moment in time. A, quote, decisive transformation of consciousness is again taking place, which has extended the ego structure into a self-free structure. Gebser offers historical examples from the Greek-Persian Wars to the Spanish conquest of Mexico to the 1315 victory of the Swiss over the Austrians to show that more developed, that is, mental over magical, consciousness is more powerful than weapons. And I think he's getting to the point you just made. Gebser does not equate more developed with more moral. In fact, he says that the negative aspect of the purposeful individualism is visible in the behavior of the Spaniards. And that's reflected by the world power's rationality and its bearers, whose strongest weapon is the technical atomic division and is no way intended to defend or conceal the Spanish cruelty. Though he acknowledges the terrible power of atomic weapons and the states who hold them, Gebser maintains that consciousness remains the strongest of all possible weapons. In particular, Gebser points out that the Soviet mind, structured by social and physical science, is closed off to consciousness. As an aside, and as a footnote to this paper, it's interesting because Gebser refers to the Russian, sort of the hypothetical Russian, which I guess was sort of the boogeyman of the day, especially if you're in West Germany. Thus, Gebser charges us with the task of bringing about a new consciousness. Doing so is difficult in the age of the state, a point Gebser acknowledges. But one will ask, how are we, each of us, to carry out this great process in our respective small primate and personal lives? Gebser draws a parallel between the development of a person and the development of humanity. A parallel of the scientific phrase ontogeny replicates phylogeny that at least I was taught in college. Gebser argues that individuals must grow psychologically and in their consciousness, a task he admits is not inevitable in this modern age, saying that if one does not find one's inner self by age 35, he remains an eternal youth. If he were alive today, I would say, why 35?
Yeah.
But this is what he said. Overcoming the ego requires what he said, most unpleasant, painful work on ourselves, which is the prerequisite. Lest we think Gebser is writing some self-help book about personal growth, Gebser makes the humanity focus of the work clear. Humanity, he says, is also us, and we must do what is in the consciousness of mankind. This is necessary to overcome the danger of the modern state. Gebser acknowledges that this is an uncomfortable solution as it puts us at odds with our cultures and with our nations, and maybe with our laws. The saying goes, he is correct when he lives and acts according to his own liver. The juxtaposition here is that what we know to be right is often considered wrong by the state, and vice versa. Right? There are locales now, I don't know about it in and around Seattle, but places in California where it's against the law to feed the homeless. There are places where it's against the law to collect water from your own gutters.
Yeah, great attention.
We are compelled by law and custom to do something harmful to ourselves personally or to humanity as a whole in the name of patriotism. Gebser calls this a crime that is, quote, now everywhere and must be avoided. Gebser ends this essay with an exhortation, as true now as it was 55 years ago. He says the following, let us try to do justice to the demands of the present world hour. So far, mankind has not failed. Why should it fail in our days when we are ready to do what is asked of us in a very clear and urgent way? It was still the case that the demand placed upon us could be fulfilled. What fate demands from us always corresponds to our forces. Every danger or threat is an encouraging challenge to prove it, to grow in it, and to overcome it. My time ends when? My time ends at 4:10?
Your time ends at 4:25.
Okay.
15 minutes.
Okay.
But sometime.
Right, I will go faster. The second part, I said I would spend most of the time on the first part. The second essay is called The Complementarity of Western and Asian Technology. And rather than read it, I'll try to boil it down and just pick out some key parts. What he says basically is that there's Western technology, which is largely external. To us in the West, technology is stuff we build. And there's Eastern technology, and I think this is somewhat of an Orientalist view, but Gebser is a product of his times, just like any of the rest of us. Eastern technology is this internal thing. And what he says is that, we think about integrality in terms of integrating the structures of consciousness, and that's not incorrect, but he's also saying that we need to integrate the internal technology of the East and the external technology of the West. That if we're just building stuff without an idea of what's happening inside, then we're missing out. And if we're only doing the stuff that's on the inside, then we will miss out, because we live in a material world, like Madonna, and we need to integrate both sides of who we are. With that in mind, I just want to skip to a part that I think is really important. Not only can this integration happen, Gebser insists that it must if we are to address the inherent deficiencies in our relative society, which Gebser sees as a Western singular view of technology as external and an Eastern view of technology as internal. Both, he thinks, are lacking, and both are unsustainable. He says, it will not be possible to continue to serve one-sidedly only external technology, just as Asia can no longer afford to live only on interior technology. Those are Gebser's words. Remember, 1968. Gebser acknowledges that this integration will be difficult, as he calls it quite decisive and a rethinking. Again, his terms. But it will be, as he says, the most important task of our time, to find the way out of the mere one-sidedness of the two basic technical forms and the forms of thought. Integrating the physical technology of the West and the mental technology of the East is necessary to Gebserian integrality. He explains that, quote, without the achievement, the necessary coming human age, which is seen as becoming a human being, can hardly become a reality, end quote. Gebser is clear about the consequences if we fail to integrate East and West. He says, security, change, and openness to strengthen these elements in the world in such a way that others who are threatening us become virulent, do not gain the upper hand. Now, one need only look at the masterful way that ISIS has picked up the effort begun by Al-Qaeda at using the internet as a recruitment tool in what Lazarsfeld called the vocational administrative use of communication. This morning's atrocities are on a website by lunch, are this afternoon's YouTube video, and are in a slick web magazine by the end of the week. In their drive to emulate Western levels of consumption, China and India are literally poisoning their water and air, making their land infertile, and are, in China's case, deliberately forgetting the lessons of Confucius if those lessons contradict the truths issued by the Beijing government and business elite. The world over, even deficient magical thinking is selective. The Chinese espouse great love for the same land they cover in rubbish, a stew of toxic waste, and dangerous levels of carbon monoxide. But they love that land. It seems that one half of Gebser's call has been met. The East has indeed embraced the technology of the West. China produces more than 95% of the cell phones in the world and more than 99% of its computers. Somewhere in the rest of the world, somebody is making that 1%. The high-speed train goes 400 kph, and it feels like the Starship Enterprise. It's gorgeous. The maglev train running between downtown Shanghai and the airport is the world's longest and fastest. And Shanghai, a city rebuilt fewer than 20 years ago, mesmerizes its visitors with its futuristic infrastructure, its modern architecture, and its thriving business sector. But it has no soul. The city is in China, but there's nothing especially Chinese about it. Shanghai has absorbed and integrated Western technology at the expense of the Tao. It is no wonder that in a Pew survey announced yesterday, Chinese respondents rated the USA as their biggest threat. In this, one can see parallels between Gebser and other authors often grouped with him, Siegfried Gideon, Harold Adams Innes, and Lewis Mumford, or at least the late Mumford, all of whom expressed concern about the relationship between humanity and technology. Gideon worried about what he called the split between thought and feeling, and wrote a book called Mechanization Takes Command, the title of which provides a dim counterpoint to contemporary authors like Kurzweil with his coming singularity, or Kevin Kelly telling us what technology wants. Gebser is closer to the later Mumford, who abandoned that optimism in techniques of civilization for the fatalistic view in the myth of the machine. The late Mumford bore little resemblance to the early. Early Mumford marveled at the marvel of technology, confident of its transformative power. Late Mumford saw the way that government and corporate power grew hypertropically and self-perpetuatingly, decreasing the humanity of humanity. Gebser, however, avoids this disenchantment. He understands the dead-end trajectory of Western technology alone and offers a way out through an integrality additional to the systasis of magic, myth, mental, aperspectival. He calls on us to integrate the internal and the external, the Eastern and the Western, in what is the most fundamental human endeavor to save ourselves and this planet.
I am delighted that you brought Lewis Mumford. We used to talk about him a lot, and now it's becoming an old fashion. I think there is also, coming back to the same point that I was sharing with Jason, the confusion between technique and telos, technology and teleology. big confusion.
Yeah.
Hardly technicians ask the big question, what this for? What the purpose? And use the word destiny. I would like to use the word teleology. Teleology, in a sense, it has a lot to do with the meaning of intentionality. Intention is not something to arrive at, but to aim for. Big, huge difference. So we never arrive at intention. It is holding or grabbing or magnetizing our desire for something, but we never arrive there. So the confusion between techne and telos becoming really very rampant in our time. I wish that people who invent anything would ask every question, what is this for? What's the purpose of it? And I think Lewis Mumford touched on that before.
You know, when you say that, it makes me think of that Tom Lehrer song about Werner von Braun, right? I just build them and send them up. Where they come down is not my concern, right? That I think you're right, absolutely. Thank you.
When you were talking about Gebser excoriating the modern state, I couldn't help but think about how Hegel had great faith in the modern state. In fact, the ultimate in consciousness, absolute knowing, and spirit was the modern state, and how different those two visions are. And I don't know if you've thought any about that, comparing the two. Is there any commonality? Because it sounds like they've come to a completely opposite conclusion.
Well, I mean, the irony isn't lost on me that Gebser's at a conference about the modern state, literally sitting next to a Nazi, talking about the power of the state. I mean, I can't even fathom that. I mean, I think that, and he's also, I go back to his quote about it takes generations to sort of repair ourselves after one of these great tears in time.
Oh, absolutely.
And so I don't know how he would have an optimistic view of the state after witnessing what he witnessed. Mike.
Well, I think it comes back to the question more basically of what does it mean to be human?
Mm-hmm.
And you talked about man and woman. I always often thought it was brotherhood and sisterhood we were looking for. That was the new awareness. And things like the Holocaust, I mean, that just is beginning to reverberate throughout at least the Western world. I saw that film about Landsman, the making of Shoah. It's just devastating. So I think Gebser is, what does it mean to be human? Even a Nazi, right, sitting next to you has some humanity somewhere, we hope.
I hope.
Yeah, I don't know. Thoughts?
Could you recap somewhat Gebser's relationship or ideas about the revolutionary era? Because as I understand from what you said, he had, maybe it's too simplistic, but a pretty negative view of the revolutionary era, American, French Revolution.
Well,
and I'm just wondering about the perspective. Well, they were overthrowing monarchy. I mean, what happened before those eras? And isn't freedom and individualism to some degree owes a tremendous step to that era?
sure, of course it does.
Yeah.
Of course it does. And I mean, that's why I tried to, throw in the sort of throw the bone to Robespierre, right? Because there is, what Gebser is talking about there is, and I don't know that I can make a comment about Gebser's in general, but I could talk about what he was saying in this particular essay. What he's saying in this particular essay is that there was sort of this moment of promise in the age of revolution, which quickly got eaten up by the worst of our spirits. That was something that troubled him greatly. That of course, he realized, and that's why he said, after these great things, we kind of went back to sleep. Thanks for bringing that up.
Just a practical question. So you have translated these two pieces?
Badly, yeah.
Can you
Oh, no.
make them
That was good.
available?
If you promise not to laugh at me, yeah.
Effort. I don't speak enough German.
Yeah, we can, I know, if we can't make them public anyway.
I don't think that we can publish them.
We've had that problem.
We have had that problem, right?
We might be able to circulate our papers and then the resources that we used or created to support those papers amongst us.
Maybe so, maybe so.
If you are willing to share your papers amongst this group, you can email me and I'll make a list and circulate it.
And just a quick plug, not that I'm attached to the university, but Oklahoma has a lot of Gebser stuff. And none of it's translated. So if you do have the time and the inclination, it's worth a trip to see.
Our next present, thank you, David.
Thank you very much.